Te wainganui tau Māori, te wainganui I te rohe hara mai, whakaroni nā pō. Just a brief introduction to you. Pay homage and acknowledge those who passed on. Also, I gave a shout out to Tauranga City Council for beautiful kaupapa early on this week, opening the new building. And what a beautiful kaupapa that is. Congratulations. Tomorrow is a big day for Māoridom within our rohe, within our sub-region. We have the Pokai, the annual event at Kuria Marae Junior, the Māori Queen, that community now way all the way before the coming. And there will be a lot of robust discussions, particularly around methods that are important. So, invitation there. Great enough to come and listen. Anyway, good morning. Enough chin wag.
Kia ora, thank you very much for that. Go through the apologies. I have apologies from Caroline Dumas, Pauline McGrath Te Whatu Ora, and Deputy Mayor Scrimge has just walked in. Thank you very much. And I believe an apology for lateness from Fijiora and Ricky. Or are they online yet? Perhaps. Okay. So, are there any other apologies to note? Not aware of any. And I also note informal apologies from Marty Grenfell, Fiona McTavish, Rachel Davey, and Dan Shenton. So, can I have a mover and seconder for those apologies, please? Councillor Scott, Deputy Chair Nees, put the motion. All those in favour, please say aye. Against, carried. Are there any conflict of interest from anyone? No? Okay. Public forum, I'm not aware of anyone for a public forum. No? Okay. So we move on to the confirmation of the minutes on page 7. Can I have a mover and seconder to confirm those minutes, please? Mayor Drysdale? Councillor Rosenboom, put the motion. All in favour, please say aye. Against, carried. So moving on to the quarterly report on page 18. I think, Craig, that's you. Okay, before I just give you a moment, Craig, I did actually want to, before we really get going, I'd acknowledge Andrew Turner for chairing SmartGrowth and leading the FDS. He leaves us a great platform from which to deliver. So, as Deputy Chair, I've assumed that role, although without certain operational aspects, which we'll cover later in the agenda. I also want to acknowledge Darren Toy, who's left Kāinga Ora. He's been a great assistance to SmartGrowth over the years, so I just wanted to acknowledge that. So with that, I think we'll move to Craig, who's now ready with the quarterly report.
Thank you, Chair. And I think at the end of this report, there's a reference there to an update on the RMA reform, and I think Christine's going to come in at that point and do a presentation on that. So. Report taken as read. There are a couple of things I just wanted to comment on and update. With the work program, just a summary there rather than a lot of detail. But we're working on the next quarter program, and for the SLG meeting in June will be a sort of a revision and update of the work program for the next 12 months. So that's a work on for us over the next quarter. The transport system plan, just a comment there about the rescaling of the TSP, and there's been a change in personnel there, and Sean Jones, who was the program manager, Tom McIntyre from TCC is now undertaking that role. Providing that point of contact and SmartGrowth for the TSP, but unfortunately he's on leave today and isn't able to be here to answer any questions if there's any on that topic, and his team are on away as well. So if there's any questions there and I can't answer them, we'll have to come back to you on that. So apologies for that. The development sector group, had their meeting in March, where there was a request made to that group for the TCC Growth Challenges review. The Penny Pirrett report went to that group for consideration. They didn't have a lot of feedback. There was no sort of strong opposition to the recommendations there, but just noted there was the only specific point made was around the regional deal proposal and a comment that they felt there was an opportunity to engage the development sector in that process to a greater extent. So that was the only specific feedback. In paragraph 18, I've mentioned there about the meeting date. That's actually wrong. It talks about the 7th of May. It's actually the 28th of June is the next development sector group meeting. So that's a wee way out. Just a correction in the report. Paragraphs 39 and 40 are a repeat of another part of the report earlier up. So it seemed a bit weird that was in there twice. So apologies for that. So those are my comments. Happy to answer any questions. But after that, as I mentioned, Christine's going to step up and provide a summary overview of the RM reform.
Thank you, Craig. I appreciate that update. So any questions? I see Deputy Chair needs.
Thank you. Well, firstly, I just wanted to note, I thought the appendix on the operating environment was really good. That's appended to that, the quarterly report. But it did obviously get completed before the news on the RMA reforms come out. So are we going to update it or accept it subject to updating, or are we going to leave it for another quarter until we know exactly, what's happening with all those national direction documents, etc.?
As Chair, we're constantly updating it because there's basically announcements every week. Nicole is doing some good work keeping track of that. The intention was that we'll have a kind of rolling update, but once a year when we review the implementation plan, we'll publish an updated version at that point. So, and as I mentioned, that we're looking at the June SLG meeting to confirm an update of the implementation plan. So that would incorporate a complete update of the operating environment statement at that time. But yeah, it is a challenge to keep it current because it's constantly changing. So,
and just one other matter, Mr. Chair. On page 29, there's a section on road pricing and tolls. I just wanted to bring to the attention of SLG members that as a result of a resolution at the Regional Transport Committee, a letter was written to Honourable Minister Chris Bishop, expressing concerns around the implementation of the TNL tolling. So just for the information of members, it was thanking the Minister for recommending an exemption not to toll drivers using the Takatimu Drive toll if they're also travelling along the TNL on the same trip. So that was something that we submitted and that was accepted. But there was some concerns expressed about ongoing concerns regarding the TNL tolling scheme. The key points were consistency across tolling regions, i.e. why is Tauranga looking at having 4 when some major roads in other regions are not getting tolled, and asking an explanation from the Ministry of Transport on the rationale for tolling and the amount of tolling in Tauranga, and seeking more transparency on the decision regarding setting tolls and consideration of retrospective tolling for significant online roading infrastructure nationwide to support an equitable approach. And then there was a request. Ministry of Transport had indicated that public transport would still have to pay the toll. on a toll road, and there was a request that NZTA and Ministry of Transport reconsider that, because we're trying to encourage people to use public transport, and it's all going to add to overhead costs. And lastly, seeking some transparency over the use of toll revenue, so that we get clear communication from government on the tolls that have been taken and what it's going to be spent on, and that there be annual reporting concerning national tolling revenue collection for each toll site. So that was just the content of the letter, just to bring you up to speed, because we're talking a lot about needing additional funding for roading infrastructure, and I just needed you to know the signals that have been sent by the Regional Transport Committee.
Thank you, Deputy Chair Nies. Are there any other questions on the quarterly report? No. Christine, available for the RM updates at this point? Okay. Christine, the floor is yours.
Okay, so yes, so if we go to the next slide. This is actually the front cover of the blueprint for resource management reform, so you might recognise it. So it was an interesting conversation where we talked about what would be the front cover, but one of the reasons that this image was selected is because actually it captures a whole lot of the RMA in one photo, and I've put down the side there what an average punter looking at that picture might see. So clearly the natural environment is there, productive land, you've got the horticultural Matapihi, you have the urban environment, both residential and the commercial environment. You've got natural hazards with sea level rise and coastal erosion, and you've got the infrastructure, so you've got the rail bridge going across. So one of the challenges with RM reform is that the resource management is so wide-reaching that in thinking about the structure for any change, you have to think about all of the elements. And so things like wind farms, mining, all those sorts of things kick in. But this image covered many of those, and then for us who know Matapihi, clearly the issue of multiple owned Māori land and cultural values is also really significant in this location. So you know, it encompassed so much. So why am I sitting here? So I was asked to be a member of the expert advisory group for the RMA that the Minister established, and I'll talk a little bit about what its role was and how it worked. So just in terms of, just click on the failings of the current system. So there seems to be universal agreement around the failings, and there's really no one out there champion the existing RMA, and these sort of summarise the key points. So it really doesn't deliver good outcomes for development. It doesn't deliver good outcomes for our natural environment, and particularly in terms of cumulative effects on the natural environment over time. It's not well designed. It's a hugely complex system, which over time has just become more and more complex. It's very slow, it's very litigious, and it's extremely costly for us as a country. And if we look at it as a package and look back to what was originally envisaged when the RMA was put in place, it was meant to have a whole series of national instruments, which are now only just beginning to come in 2025. It has very little compliance, and if you think about how important our environment is to us as a country, each of us do our, there are definitely bits of compliance that are occurring, but it's not comprehensive, particularly if you're looking at it from a systems perspective. A systems monitoring is overall, is the RMA and the implementation of the RMA achieving our urban outcomes, our environmental outcomes, and our economic outcomes. So that's not really a core part of the overall system. So moving on, so the national government repealed the previous Labor government's RMA reform, which had many millions of dollars and years spent on it, and reverted back to the existing before the new one effectively came into force. And then they made a decision to commence an overhaul. And to do so, what they did is they came up with a series of design principles for the RM reform, and that was approved by Cabinet in mid-2024. And they established an expert advisory group who were tasked to create a blueprint for the RMA reform. So there were 7 members on that panel, 6 and a chair. We were all people who work with the RMA on a day-to-day basis, all of us frustrated with the problems it creates, and all of us wholeheartedly committed to trying to create something that would be a game changer and shift the dial very purposely going forward. So it was a bit different perhaps than some of the other advisory groups that have been set up in the past, which seem to have more of a mix of academic or central government policy people. They were all practitioners in their own field and chosen across a whole range of specialties that were very, very relevant to the RMA. We only had 12 weeks to do our work. So it was a very, very intense period, and I thank TCC for allowing me to go and do it, because we were each appointed individually, not as representatives of organisations. We delivered our report by the 20th of December, which was our deadline, and the Minister considered it over Christmas, and it went to Cabinet on the 24th of March. So again, that shows you the pace that the government is working. We had some 23, I think, recommendations. 1 was declined. The majority were accepted, some in totality, and some with further work to be done about the method of implementation and where the decision sat, whether it sat with Cabinet or with the Minister. So some of the recommendations were delegated to the Minister. So, so what was the overall approach to reform? So we sort of set up, and this information is that all this is publicly available. I've just tried to pull it together to tell a bit of a story. So the real clear direction was from Cabinet was upholding property rights. So that was a really strong theme that came through, and it was also a key element of the ACT coalition agreement. We wanted a system that was achieving policy goals within environmental limits. So rather than reinventing every time, having really clear limits and then enable policy to be developed within that. To declutter the system, it came through over and over again that there are multiple instruments at multiple layers, and when people are trying to weave their way through the RMA, they have to look at all of those and many times justify against many policy documents which duplicate, vary, conflict, don't align, all sorts of things, and it's just a matrix of confusion. So trying to reduce that repetition and get rid of processes, make those processes clearer, swifter, and far more cost effective. Uphold the treaty settlements. Seeking to use terminology in case law as much as possible where it could be applied, because we're conscious that the existing RMA has built up a lot of interpretation and law over time, and there's huge litigation risks. And that was one of the key criticisms of the Labor government Branderson report and the legislation that came out of it, that it would be hugely litigious, and so we would spend years in court. And so one of the key drivers was to move away from that. And that bottom bullet point I put in bold because it was something that was in our minds all the way through, was this concept of taking a proportionate and pragmatic approach. And this concept of the reach does not exceed our grasp, that actually we're a very small country, and we can't afford the system as a country collectively, any of us, and nor can the environment. And so actually we need to create something that's proportionate and pragmatic but achieves our objectives. So that was one of the mantras, if you like, that we kept coming back to as we were doing our work. So this is the overarching diagram. So at the top of the yellow highlight, and I'll work through each of these, this is really where the government sets it. So there's two, the RMA would be replaced with 2 acts. It's the Cabinet decision, a Planning Act and an Environment Act. The legislation effectively establishes a framework. It sets goals and principles, and then there would be one national policy direction under each act. So at the moment we have a plethora of them. They would all be combined. So what the stuff that relates to planning would go under the Planning Act clearly, and the others would be in the Environment Act. There would be nationally standardised zones, national standards and regulations, and then at the middle yellow bit is where local authorities would work together to create a plan that relates to our area, our region. And then at a national level, the Compliance and Enforcement and Planning Tribunal will kick in. So it sort of starts at central government level, then moves down to an applied level at a local authority level, working together collectively from a regional perspective. And then the central government framework of enforcement and compliance then picks up the moving forward. So I'll move through each of those bits separately. So in terms of central government roles. So the Planning Act is very much focused on land use planning and regulation, and the national policy direction underneath that would be succinct. It would implement goals that sit in the Act, and the Cabinet paper has, we propose a series of goals in the paper, our report. The national government wants to look at those further and refine them. This direction is to resolve the conflict between goals or provide direction on how conflict is to be reconciled, because currently we have a whole lot of conflict and there's no direction at all as to how each can be addressed. So that was a purposeful statement. And then within that would be national standardised zones, which would effectively set default zones. And that's something that happens in the UK, in Australia, and you would have heard the minister talking about it in Japan. So we have over 1,000 zones in New Zealand. Those countries that implement those zones generally have somewhere between 10 to 30, so totally different process. But we did provide for enabling bespoke processes outside where there was a valid reason to address local variations or specific local circumstances. And then the Environment Act, Natural Environment Act is the same thing, but it deals with setting defaults for human health and environmental limit setting, and again allows some bespoke processes at a local level. So the concepts underpinning both of the acts are very similar. So then you move into the local government role. We had recommended that the spatial plan set separately from what would effectively be a combined city district plan. The Cabinet considered it and decided that should all be one plan with different chapters, with the regional spatial plan being a chapter in the overall plan. The regional spatial plan, if you're thinking about that in a smart growth context, will have statutory weight, and I'll talk a little bit about that. Under this system, and the RPS of the regional policy statement would no longer exist, and this plan would sit in an e-portal, which would be a nationally housed e-portal. So you could go in online, you could select which region you want to be in, and then you could drill down to your specific geographic local area to understand what the rules would be. And so that would be a national database. So each council won't be running their own district plan or currently as a regional policy statement, environmental plans. They'll all be housed on one national database, all standardised throughout the country. So the regional spatial plans, I've put a little bit of detail on this, given this is smart growth. Its role is to provide that strategic direction. It does very much what a smart growth does. So it deals with future urban areas, existing and future infrastructure. As I said, it has statutory weight, which is a significant shift from the status quo where it doesn't. We proposed that it would be flexible in that you could choose to do it at a regional level or a sub-regional level and join those sub-regional levels together, so that was flexible. There would be mandatory and optional matters for spatial plans, and that's really to acknowledge that some areas are more complex, have got more critical issues, and comes back to this cost effectiveness and reach versus grasp and pragmatic. There's no point requiring say a council in Tamaranui or down south to do a whole lot around urban growth or around a whole lot around particular natural hazards that they might not have, but where they have got those, then it makes sense. So there'd be a series of mandatory ones and then things that you'd have to look and say, are they relevant to our community? Should we be spending time and effort on them to look after our planning environment and our urban areas, to look after our natural environment and the outcomes that we want? Or is that not needed and not justifying the effort that would have to go in? So that comes back to this cost issue. The regional spatial plans will be very powerful in that they will look at how you integrate at a localised level, applied to your geographic area, the relationship between the matters in the Planning Act and the National Matters in the Environment Act. And so that integration of decisions between the acts and how those conflicts might apply in your jurisdictional areas is a matter that you can address within your regional plan. And then as that has statutory weight, that would be applied when it comes to an application level further in the decision-making process.
Christine, if I may just ask a question there, can you define exactly what you mean by have statutory weight as opposed to what the current system is?
So the factors are in there are a key consideration and given weight when you're looking at any application. So if something is being applied, it does require a resource consent, then the content in the regional spatial plan is one of the few places, because remember we've taken a lot of the other instruments out. So that would be a key place to go and have a look for what the policy direction is as to what's envisaged to be provided for or not provided for, or the outcomes to be sought in that specific geographic area.
Statutory weight currently is through the RMA, Section 5 stuff.
Yeah. Yes, and it's predominantly sitting in the city plans and the RPSs where we give effect to the spatial plan, but the spatial plan itself doesn't have that weight. It's given the count to, but it doesn't have the key weight, where it now would become a key document much more in the hierarchy. And some of the other documents that we currently go, so two things: one, it has more weight, and the other documents like the RPS would no longer exist. And the documents that are in here would be much thinner and leaner and non-duplicative. So it would become one of the core locations to look for policy direction. Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah. Councillor McMillan.
Oh, thanks, Christine. How does the fast track process feed into that? So let's say you've got this statutory spatial plan and something that's going through the fast track isn't in that plan. How does that work?
Yeah, I think that's a bit more of a transition, and I don't know if the final decisions have been made, but the thinking was that if you get the system up and running, which clearly it's not yet, then you shouldn't need fast track to the same extent, because you'll be much clearer and the pathway would be much faster. So you could use that, and then whether there is still a need for a fast track, that would be obviously a government decision. But that was the thinking behind the whole framework. Is fast track has been established because the RMA had all those issues that we talked about at the beginning. Design a system that would address those issues, then the question really should arise as to, do you still need fast track? Yeah.
Mayor Drysdale.
Thanks, Christine. I'm just keen to dig into a little bit of this sort of region versus sub-region and how you sort of deal with that. So what you're saying, for example, if we've got SmartGrowth, we obviously come up with our plan, and then we will go and talk to Rotorua and Whakatane and Kawerau, and then we'll try to merge them all into a sort of super plan.
Yeah, I think if you think of it as a menu or chapters, you would have some parts that apply to everybody, which is in a way how effectively the Regional Council does the RLTP at the moment. It's an overarching, it talks about all the things that apply across the region, and then within that you have plans that relate to the Western Bay transport area, the Eastern Bay and Rotorua. So it would sort of be similar. So where you've got some similarities like we have with the Western Bay, you would probably do a sub-regional Western Bay, and then the Eastern Bay would have theirs and Rotorua would potentially have theirs. They would all sort of click together, and you'd have things that applied across all of them. What we're also saying, in the cabinet paper, it talks about we saw benefit in having a national spatial plan, and that national spatial plan might deal with things like airports, ports, rail linkages, some of those big things. And so it's not something that's a requirement that's come through the cabinet paper, but it is identified as preferred. Then you would have interregional stuff that you would look at. So we would be looking over to the Waikato about the linkages to the Waikato. We would be Rotorua would probably be looking south. So those interregional linkages, you talk about those. Then you talk about things that relate across your region, and then you'd have these sub-regional elements. And so you would work together on the bits that make sense to work together. But again, this concept of let's not create complexity for the sake of complexity. Where it has benefits and it's relevant, you would do that. And where actually it makes much more sense to have a conversation about business land of the sub-region. There are some interfaces with Rotorua, but relatively limited. Spend our time thinking about the things that are relevant for our local area. So that was sort of the thinking behind it.
Christine, you talked about bespoke variations to standard zones, and one of the problems, if you like, that I foresee is something like the tech park zone, which is highly bespoke. Do you think that will be able to be accommodated within as a bespoke variation? Because obviously trying to fit it into industrial or commercial, a standardized zone like that is going to be highly problematic.
Yeah, so we didn't design any of the zones other than sort of knowing what's broadly. So it's something like that might fit in a reserve zone if there's a standardized reserve zone. But otherwise, yes, so the framework is that envisages a series of standardized zones being created that apply across the country. And then effectively, again, like a pick and mix menu, you select those zones as they relate to your geographic locations. And where you consider that the zone isn't appropriate for whatever reason, you can do an alternative. We described that process as being stickier because we didn't want to make it too simple, because then you lose all of the benefits of standardisation and everything else was sought to be achieved. But also if you make it too straitjacketed, then you're not effectively allowing for those circumstances. So you can go through a process, you have to justify. So there's this concept called a justification report, where you have to justify why you have varied from the standardised zones and why you consider that the standardised zones isn't appropriate. Go through your rationale. And the Cabinet Minute hasn't yet defined the processes that would apply, but it's more likely to be a longer process with probably more hearing type elements to it than if you take a bespoke zone from the standardised zone. You're effectively on the fast track through, because it's been through all the national processes and it's considered appropriate. So you're not having a debate about distance from boundaries and noise levels or whatever it might be. It's like, that's really not up for argument. You could only probably have a conversation about, in this circumstance, is there something bespoke that would be more appropriate because of the unique characteristics? So yeah.
I would suggest that the tech park zone needs to be quite different from a standard reserve, so Torrens domain kind of zone. Yeah.
So so you could create your own, or you might be able to use the standard of a reserve as a base for your bespoke, and then tweak it as it's relevant for the particular location. So that's sort of the type of thing that could happen.
Deputy Chair Nees.
Oh, thank you. Just a question, trying to get my head around and get it out of the old RMA mindset. So this is going to be a plan that is consulted on because it's going to have legislative weight. And it's fundamentally based on the principle that people can do whatever they want within the zone.
Yep.
As long as it doesn't affect the environment or their neighbours. So thinking about the different approaches of developing spatial plans across the region, in the Eastern Bay, it's just blobs, right? Of this is where things might go in the future, which is quite difficult when it's a legislative plan, because people tend to look at property boundaries. So Rotorua is pretty tight with regard to their proposed growth areas, etc. And so is SmartGrowth. But has there been any thought about to what scale that the spatial plans have got to be developed down to? Are the maps supposed to be going right down to property boundaries?
So that's not something that's covered in our report. So we talk about it more broadly as spatial planning and where appropriate places are. In the report, it talks about identifying future locations, which in my view could be more generic because you haven't got down to that level. And then it talks about what the process. So we just go back one slide. Yeah. So it talks about you'd identify your regional spatial plans. If you think about our spatial plan, which we know really well, you'd have your areas like last smart growth strategy, we had Tauriko West, which still was zoned rural at the time. We identified it as urban. We were really clear where the boundaries were, and so that would sit there. And then when that comes to be rezoned, it has a much faster pathway. But it would also provide, like for a Titumu like example, where that's ring fence because it's geographically ring fenced naturally. But if it wasn't, it would be a blob, and you would identify that, and then our report says you would have a faster pathway or a different pathway to get that then zoned, and it would be faster than something that wasn't at all in your spatial plan. And that what we propose, and they haven't gone to this level in the cabinet paper because it's sort of down a layer, so whether they fully accept all our recommendations or not, but that your planning process would be proportionate to the complexity of the development, the scale of the development, the impact of the development. So again, coming to that point that I put in bold right at the beginning, so that there isn't this hugely complex process for something that's relatively simple, but something that's quite complex, which at the regional spatial plan level hadn't had perhaps a lot of work done. You would create a proportionately appropriate process to go through it, noting that your environmental and your urban outcomes had been defined at the spatial planning level, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Councillor Scott.
At the moment, our plans get their authority from the from the consultation process and so on. As you've explained it, or as I understand it, each chapter, so each local authority would go out for consultation. Who owns the overall consultation for the total plan?
Yeah, so I can't remember how much of this. So some of the processes in the cabinet minute approved in principle, but they identify they need to do a bit more work on exactly the detail. But what we were looking at, and now the cabinet's moved the regional spatial plan in, which we had as a separate process run first, and then the other stuff comes later. But they're seeing it as one package, that you would have the stuff that related to the regional spatial plan and the elements that were consistent effectively done together, and you would have a partnership arrangement of how you would work through that, and then each council would effectively manage the bits that relate to their geographic area or their jurisdiction if it was in respect of the environment, but all collectively working together because this one package has to be integrated and fit together.
So as a ratepayer, you'd get a package with the various consultation questions and.
So it's really been turned on its head to say for a user in this environment, I mean, to be frank, they don't really care whether it's Western Bay, Regional Council, Tauranga City, what applies to my land, what am I allowed to do, what am I allowed to not do, and how we're looking after the environment overall, which is, tangata whenua, clearly that's their perspective. So to try to bring it more from a customer user perspective together, and then as local government, we need to make that work. And so I'd envisage it'll be a bit like your agreement that you enter into each council, each triennium, but on steroids. And it does envisage that you'd have some sort of administrative collective entity or arrangement that would work over the whole lot. So something like this and something like the smart growth, administrative agency. So you'd have a resource that was applied, and you may and likely have some sort of technical expertise that was applied across, so you get some consistency. But each council still owning its own destiny, particularly in terms of determining what applies to each council's area or each council's jurisdictional responsibility. Yeah, trying to get that balance.
Thank you, Chrissy. I think you can carry on now.
Okay. So we've talked about this one. We've talked about the next slide. So Treaty of Waitangi, so you would have probably read quite a lot about this in the media. This is something that the Cabinet Minute hasn't fully landed on, has identified there's more work. It does determine that the new RMA will uphold the treaty settlements as a principle of the reform, but there's further work to be done in terms of legislative drafting and how this is going to be approached. So it's probably not something I can comment on because it varied from some of the stuff that picked up some of the elements, but not all. So then the next one is, where are we going next? Oh, so compliance and enforcement. So this is quite a shift as well. What this does is moves to a compliance and enforcement function at a national level. Complaint incident response, national standards for enforcement, national standards for auditing, looking at plan rules and conditions. There would be standardised conditions for much of the stuff, including environmental conditions that would apply to consents. And the enforcement agency would be looking at all of this. It would be funded at a national level, but have central and local government funding. A lot more focus, given you're freeing up and enabling a lot more and requiring much less to go through a consenting process. There's a need for much more at the monitoring and compliance end because it's more enabling, reducing costs. But if it's enabling and doesn't have adequate enforcement, then we're potentially not going to get the outcome. So it's quite a shift from the current arrangement, and a shift in terms of the structural arrangements of where those resources and responsibilities sit, from moving from local government to central government.
Is it envisaged that there'll be proactive compliance monitoring? Because at the moment it's generally on complaint.
Yes, so I'm just trying to remember trying to split between what was in the conversations, which are still under non-disclosure, and what's sitting in the actual report. So yes, there is an intention that there would be more monitoring and compliance, and I suppose you could sort of liken a little bit to the IRD type approach, where you would envisage that there would be a risk assessment process at a national level, identifying what needs to be effectively monitored, and that would be managed. Plus, when things come to attention that need to be addressed or reviewed, that would happen as well. And then enforcement, because the other thing is that some enforcements are really complex, and some relatively small councils with limited resources are trying to manage enforcement. And, is that efficient from a country perspective? Again, does that make sense?
Councillor Cosby.
Thanks, Christine. We were trying to work this out in our own workshop. At what level would that actually mean? Because to give an example, in the regional sector, currently there are 225,000 active resource consents. Our own council manages 8,200 with 34 staff. So if you do the maths, there's an empire to be built in Wellington. Is that what they are intending, or will they still have a very high level monitoring and enforcement regime in Wellington, and let the whatever councils, wherever they land, what they look like, do the day-to-day stuff?
And I don't think that that's been landed on. So we did talk, and if you read the report, it talks about those options were considered. And I think so. We're now sort of starting to drill down where Cabinet sort of said, yes, we agree with this, makes sense. We now need to design the detail of how it works, which is sort of what you're asking. So but the report will talk about the bits that we considered, and we did look at, do you do some sort of the local on the ground and your sort of first facing monitoring and enforcement? And then does it escalate to a national level? So I think those are the things they'll consider when they do the design. And I think the other thing too is you need to think about the difference between where we are now. And I know we have consents that have, 20 years, but we were planning a system that we're looking to have, in this country for 30 plus years. So when consents are coming through, they will then move to the simplified approach. The standards will be applying, the national standards will be applying. Simplified, you would have standardised resource consent conditions that will apply. So there'll be a lot less to be monitored. And it could be that some current consent holders will apply for a new consent under this new framework because it's more cost efficient for them to do so in terms of managing the environmental resource that they're doing under the new framework, which will lessen some of that compliance as well. There's also, if you look it talks about the use of digital tools, and it's possible that there'd be some sort of a nationalised system for monitoring and reporting compliance as well, so that that's an element that's in there, and it's picked up in the Cabinet Minute of something to be further investigated. So trying to use digital way more portals for monitoring and information flowing, and then data analytics to identify where there might be issues. That sort of, so really much trying to think of it in a new environment rather than an old environment that was created back in the 1990s. What could that look like?
Councillor Scott.
So you've been talking about compliance in terms of making sure the consent holder is complying. Is there envisaged a level of compliance to make sure that whoever is enforcing or checking or monitoring things at a local level also complies? Because there, as you've just said, there's a big change of mindset, and I can imagine that that will be a rough transition in terms of the person on the ground.
So we didn't really get into that detail, but I think the overarching principle that sits in the design and also the cabinet papers reinforced is this concept of, if it's more enabling, we have to monitor and enforce because we want the right outcomes. And so that, I think that will perpetrate into the design of the detailed system that would, and it's unlikely. And I think if you look and see that they've put a national regulator in place, they're going, we need something different from what's currently there to get the right outcomes. Yeah.
Councillor McMillan.
I think you've just answered. It was really about the permitted activity being massively enabled, so therefore needing to ramp up compliance and monitoring because the activities are permitted. So, but you've already answered that, so thank you.
Yeah, cool. So then just moving on to...
Sorry, before you do, Deputy Mayor Skiller.
Okay.
Thank you, and thanks, Christine. Just a question on permitted activity and enabling. Is there recognition of where the liability sits when the enabling activity or the enabled activity causes an environmental issue in a region? Is that then paid for by the region? Where does the accountability for, I guess, for any consequences of enabled activities sitting? Is that with the region or is that picked up at central government?
So theoretically, there shouldn't be a negative impact because it's only enabled within the environmental limits that have been set under the Natural Environment Act. So it's not carte blanche, do what you like. So those standards will be very, very clear as to looking after the environment, and it does enable things like offsetting and betterment. So there are tools that mean that in net gross, the environment is no worse off and possibly better off. But it comes down to those standards being really well designed. And the issue that we currently have now in New Zealand is every council is designing them and they're all different and there isn't one consistent approach. So if they're right, and if they're not, then they should be tweaked over time is what will likely happen. Yeah.
Deputy Mayor, Deputy Chair.
Thank you. Just a question about transition. One thing that we've been worrying about is we've got 600 odd pre-RMA consents that are due for reconsenting next year. They expire next year. And we either process them under the current system and then they'll get, they'll have very similar conditions, I would think, although there'll be tighter limits, etc. Or we seek to get the date to get some extension to enable us to move them into the new system. Has any consideration been had within your group on transition?
So it wasn't really part of our brief. The bit of our brief that was relevant to that was we were asked to look at the ability to switch on parts of the change as quickly as possible. But the system that we recommended was an integrated system, so it wasn't that practical to do so. But we thought it was one that you could actually get up and running very quickly. So transition as such wasn't really a core part of our brief in 12 weeks. Comes back to...
But the devil's going to be in the detail, because we've got 36 years, 35-year consents in some instances, and they're going to last for a very long time, or you've actually got to impinge on people's property rights to actually change it. So there's an inherent conflict.
And I think it just comes back to we would ask to design a blueprint of a future framework for the RMA, not all the detail that goes with it, because it's just impossible in the timeframe. So it was a scope question. Yeah.
Carry on, Christine.
So then, along with is the disputes process. So again, that's currently very lengthy, very costly, very uncertain. So the Cabinet has supported the principle of a planning tribunal to be established. It would seek to be much simpler, faster. A council could use it if they wanted to, if they wanted clarity on particular interpretation or as it relates to conditions of consent or other matters. People can use it if they think something should be publicly notified or limited notified, and the council hasn't done that. So some of the things that currently are quite difficult and complex and takes years to do could be really quickly done. And then the Environment Court would really be doing the high order content. So it would deal with both resource consents and plan review functions. So a different type of approach. And then the last couple of slides were just really about consequences. So where does this leave us? It leaves us with a framework where, as I said before, limits and standards are set. It's really focusing the local level on where development should and shouldn't occur. It means that the technical stuff is done very much at a national level, and locally you're applying it or justifying a reason why it's not appropriate to apply it. We've talked about the removal of duplication in this moving to e-portal and digital. The Cabinet has paused or phased or changed phase 2 work considerably as a result of phase 3. You would have seen that happen starting at about December last year, and now the government's come out and said how it's going to, what it's going to do in phase 2 and what it's not, so that this has had quite a different impact. I think in terms of consequences, interesting, the economic analysis that's been done on the report says that this new framework would reduce administration costs and admin costs by 45% compared to the current system. The previous RM reform the Labor government had done, their analysis at that time was 7%. So, it's a quantum leap differently. Estimation of $14.8 billion worth of savings, and that excludes the development benefits that come from being able to bring your developments on quicker. So, quite a shift. So, interesting bits that I thought you might like to know about, that you may or may not be aware of. In the Cabinet decision, there's a resolution that says the Minister Bishop and the Minister of Local Government need to report back to Cabinet by July with an update on whether the whether the local government reform should be progressed as a consequence of changes to the RM system. Interesting, the Cabinet paper itself had a deadline of December, and the minute says they have to report back there into December 25, and the minute says that there needs to be an update by July 25. So I thought that was interesting that you'd like to know. The bill is to proceed to the Select Committee by the end of the year. The other thing that's happened this week is Minister Bishop has written to the opposition parties seeking their comments, and Minister Hipkins has noted, although you've got all the normal politics, but that there's a lot of common ground. And certainly much of the elements of the planning tribunal and some of the enforcement elements that are in RMA 3 built strongly on what was in the Labor's RMA package. So there was a lot in there that made a lot of sense, and it was picked up and modified slightly. So it's not surprising that Labor may have some levels of support for some elements of it, and they had also been looking at standardised zones as well. So, there are some similarities. So there's hope that we may not have another swing.
So it does look as if there may not be much scope envisaged for local government to feed into what local government reform might look like. Do you have any comments on that?
No.
Do what you will. Okay.
Yeah. And it's not something that was covered in our paper. It wasn't part of our scope, but clearly it's a question that you ask yourself when you see the scale of change and the impact that has. So I just thought I'd share with you. So as a member of the panel, you sit there and think, what are the commentators going to say? And it's been quite a bit starting to emerge in the last couple of weeks, and it's all very generally positive. But I thought probably the most impactful were these statements from the New Zealand initiative that were issued last week, talking about it being a game changer. Common sense replaces complexity. actually, rather than controlling everything, controlling really things that truly affect neighbours or the environment in some material way. Freeing up local authority to focus on genuine local priorities instead of reinventing the wheel over and over. And then the last comment was really about staying the course and resisting pressure to actually come up with some complicated exemptions that mean that we recreate the very maze that we're trying to escape. And I thought that was a beautifully written quote. So it's, I'll leave it there.
Okay, I think that's the end of the presentation. Were there any further questions for Christine? Deputy Mayor Scrimgeour.
We currently have the situation which you've described, trying to simplify and take some of the layers out of that. But say a project gets a resource consent approval, and now they might require a building consent, and the local authority can have a rather different view, sometimes be very difficult in regard to achieving that. Is there going to be any mechanism to address those sort of issues through these reforms, or will those sort of issues still remain?
That's not within the scope of these reforms. So, but whether the concepts are applied in a broader sense would be probably the question I'd ask, but it just sits outside of the brief that we had, and sits outside the cabinet minute scope of this issue. Yeah.
Thank you. Were there any questions on this or the wider quarterly update? Materi.
Chair, it is to do with the quarterly update. I just want to thank Craig for including the tangata whenua Māori content in his report on page 34. But I just want to make a comment rather than a question, is that whilst the smart growth strategy has strong foundations, these policies changes can undermine tangata whenua aspirations if proactive measures aren't taken into account. The priority should, from a tangata whenua perspective and iwi hapu perspective, the priority should be securing commitments from local government and regional partners to uphold iwi and hapu-led development despite central government shifts. So I just want to make that comment because I know it is happening in your own council. I just want to make sure that it's robust enough. So kia ora, thank you.
Thank you. I think we can. I think we should note that in the minutes that your comment there. Any other questions? Councillor Cosby.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I think in the light of Christine's report and what we know now, it's probably appropriate that Smart Growth itself develops at least an initiation of a report, so we're all clear about what's ahead of us. You know, I'm aware that the mayors and chairs are thinking about it already across the Bay of Plenty, which is quite appropriate. But you know, we're here as a smart growth team, and you know, there's a lot of work that's going to happen in a very short period of time, and I think it's best to start some thinking and initiate that now rather than waiting until the detail comes through in the draft bills, because that will happen quite rapidly, and the manner in which we meet or don't meet would mean that, you know, there's an opportunity to miss out on some very good thinking. At a personal level, I'm supportive of the structure, but the devil is always in the detail, and it's a massive piece of work ahead of everybody.
I think it might be appropriate to ask Craig to liaise with the CEs on that you know, how we coordinate that kind of work, because there's a lot of our councils do a lot of stuff doing. Our councils are individually doing a lot of stuff, and if you want something to come up to smart growth, we just need to coordinate how that's working.
Yeah, it's fine. And certainly that's what we had in mind, you know, knowing what's ahead. And, you know, certainly the next meeting of SLG needs a comprehensive commentary on what the implications might be. You know, what of our work streams we should put on hold or what we should continue with, those sorts of things. So it's definitely on our work plan to do that. So yeah, and absolutely the partners are all doing their own work on it. So we need to make sure we collaborate across the partners for that.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I don't see any further questions. So if there's a recommendation to receive the quarterly report, can I have a mover and a seconder, please? Mayor Drysdale, councillor Crosby. Assume there's no further debate, I'll put the motion. All those in favour, please say aye. Against, carried. So moving on to page 35, and we have the Tupakari Advisory Team report. So Tapio and Elisha.
Ai, morena tātou tuatahi, mihi nei ki a koe ki a Elijah nau he tuku nei nā karaki hei timata mai rā I tā tātou nei huinga I te ata nei no reira, tēnā hoki koe tēnā tātou katoa. Following on after Christine is obviously a huge undertaking with a 2-page report. But I do just want to comment that the Combined Tangata Whenua Forum are obviously going to be very interested in taking the direction around how these reforms, so in terms of the planning and the environment, which are critical aspects in achieving the Combined Tangata Whenua Forum outcomes that we've integrated into the strategy, and then following on from how we collectively move forward in terms of our strategy. I think the positive though is that we have a lot of evidential information and data that actually backs up where we are. So I think we are in a good position to look forward to the designing the process for us moving forward collectively under the new structure, and definitely, spatial planning for tangata whenua is a tool that we look to embrace, and I'm sure across our region, our other iwi whanaunga are looking for the same opportunity to embrace and to move forward, because there looks like to be a lot of protection around those key elements. Te taio is huge for tangata whenua, it's huge for all of us sitting around here, and working within environmental limits is exactly what we were talking about in our strategy. So yeah, I think we're in a good place to move forward. Anyway, just moving back to the Tupakali report, I'm just going to take it as being read. Like I said, it is short, and the key component to come out of the report that we're presenting today and looking support from yourselves is the workshop that occurred in February, and the establishment of Te Rōpū Arotahi. So Te Rōpū Arotahi is the opportunity to progress the Combined Tangata Whenua outcomes between the quarterly meetings. So we can't get everything done in what would have been a 3-hour meeting, but extended through our workshop extended to through to the afternoon, because people made the commitment that they wanted to progress forward, and I think the establishment of Te Rōpū Arotahi is an outcome from that we need to do work in between each Combined Tangata Whenua Forum meeting, and that's not just for the Tupakali team to make that direction, that we need the advice and support and direction from the forum members. And so those members that are identified on page 36 in terms of those representatives give us that mandate to move forward on those key outcomes, to provide us that technical support and advice around those key outcomes, and around those 2 key points: effectiveness and efficiency of the Combined Tangata Whenua Forum, making sure that we're moving forward on the outcomes that we've identified to work with SmartGrowth and around those achievements. So like Te taio, the environmental key to tangata whenua involvement is around our empowering Māori housing, which is one of our key actions in the IFP, and so how does that translate? And then just like we're all just been talking about, how do we monitor moving forward, is the development of appropriate KPIs that don't just measure numbers. While numbers are a key component in setting up a database to move forward to see if we are progressing. The example that we raised in December with the SmartGrowth Trends report is monitoring how effective our policies are collectively amongst us around moving the number of consents that are issued on multiple and Māori land. And so in December, we identified, there's around 7.9 homes that are currently being built on Māori land over the last 10, 15 years. Empowering Māori housing looks to move that forward to around 45 homes per year, with the aim of somewhere between 400 to 450 over the next 10 years. So that's a huge acceleration from where we currently are. And maybe the changes that we've just been reviewing will assist and support that move forward, which is really around addressing the Māori housing crisis. And so I suppose that's the context and the background for the Te Ropu Arotahi and the opportunity for us to move forward. Kia ora.
Sure, Te Pio. Any questions? I see Deputy Chair Nees is straight in there, so Jane.
Thank you. I understand from our staff that they're very supportive of Te Ropu Arotahi, but I'm a little bit unclear about it. So is it a SmartGrowth entity? Does it require funding from SmartGrowth? If it does require funding, what would be the funding? Does it need to be entered into the SmartGrowth budget? Does it have terms of reference if it's a SmartGrowth entity? So that it's those sort of questions that I've got.
Oh boy, there wasn't.
I think we're live still. Okay, so Te Pio, if you'd like to answer that.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, those are all really good questions, and so we're looking to. So first answer is yes, it's going to be a Smart Growth Committee underneath, or that works under the Combined Tangata Whenua Forum. So it will be supported the same way that members attend the Combined Tangata Whenua Forum, which are attendance meeting fees. So that's the component that they will be attending the workshops or the meetings that we have to progress those actions moving forward. So I think there's the 5 members that are identified in the report, their fees are fairly minimal. They still fit and come under the existing budget that we have for tangata whenua participation in Smart Growth. So we have that budget and it will be in that budget line. So it comes within it. So it's definitely within budget, because there are only 5 members. I think if you look at the fee that they currently receive, it's well within that budget. Terms of reference will be presented to the Combined Tangata Whenua Forum on the 6th of May. It's part of the package. In terms of the establishment, we didn't have that obviously on the 12th of February, but we will be looking to present that at the next Combined Tangata Whenua Forum in terms of their terms of reference moving forward. Yes.
That's great, thank you. So will that terms of reference also come to us, or is that a strictly Combined Tangata Whenua Forum matter?
Happy to present it at the next SLG meeting.
Yeah, well, thank you. It's really good to hear that we've got the budget to actually service it, because we've already pared down our Smart Growth budget. So anyway, thank you for that, Pia. Look forward to hearing more.
Thank you. Any more questions of Te Pio? No? Okay, so we've got 3 recommendations there: to receive the report, support the establishment of Te Ropu Arotahi, and notes that group is supported by Te Pakuri and the respective council teams. So can I have a mover and seconder for those, please? That's Batieri. Would you like to move that? Sorry, can you put your microphone on? I think you're...
Kia ora, thank you, Chair. Can we have an addition to number 2, the support of the establishment, is that it comes back to the Smart Growth SLG, the next meeting, with a report?
Yes, I think that's perfectly acceptable if you've got that. Okay, and a seconder, please. We have seconder, Deputy Mayor Scrimger. Is there any further debate? No? Okay, so I'll put the motion. All those in favour, please say aye. Against? Carried. Thank you, Te Pio. So move on to the last item in the open part of the agenda, which is advancing infrastructure investment. I'll suggest that we go through this and then we'll break for some morning tea. So if we move on to this item, and I think this is you, Craig.
Chair, this is a piece of work that's been led by Nicola primarily. So Nicola's going to present.
Yes, so we've completed this analysis of the investment needs to support growth. It's all detailed out in Appendix 1. I just want to make clear that it is quite high level and just focused on the critical infrastructure that's required to support growth. It doesn't go down into a small scale level of detail in terms of internal development infrastructure. The headline is that it's showing a $4.9 billion worth of investment is needed. That is over a 10-year period, but I will say that some of the infrastructure that we've identified would support growth beyond that period as well. I think there's a graph that we can just pop up. It's actually just the graph that's on page 38 of your report anyway. So, and really that's just highlighting, I don't think it will be a surprise to anyone that the gap is mostly in transport. And then we have another graph there as well. Craig, I don't know if you want to talk to that one around sort of those investment levels, or even NZTA might want to comment on that as well.
Just to say, I think the version that's in the report is quite blurry and hard to read. I don't know, some of you may have struggled to read the notes in it. So we just thought produce a kind of clearer version on screen if there were people were struggling to see. But yeah, the data in this chart was provided from NZTA. It's really trying to show the scale of the investment in RONs over the next decade, but also showing that relative to what previous investment has been in the region on strategic transport. So it is a significant step up. So, and I think that's no surprise to anyone, but potentially, I guess, a product of projects that have been delayed over time, and I guess in the end, roads like the Northern Link having to be done to address problems that have emerged through urbanisation to the north. These things do. The need for them does come through in the end, and we end up with a little bit of a bow wave of cost, and that seems to be what this is showing. But it does need to be addressed. It does illustrate the scale of the issue.
Great. Can I just clarify? Has all those numbers been converted to $2025, or what's? Because obviously, when you talk about last decade average investment, that's yeah.
I don't know the answer to that. Whether our colleagues in comment. Sure, that'd be good.
Please do.
Great, through you, Chair. Yeah, in terms of the previous spend data, that hasn't been inflated. It's just predominantly the previous spend cost, just yeah, over the last 10 years.
This is outturn cost.
Yeah.
Okay. Carol.
It's pretty much finished. I just wanted to note that our next steps for this is to monitor that gap through the PDA tracker to see whether we're making progress on that. And also to develop a sub-regional position paper on funding tools and what you know, what the sub-region thinks will have the most impact. Yeah, happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Nicola. Before I go to questions, I see Councillor Crosby. I did just want to highlight the slight change in nomenclature we're using, which is investment need rather than funding gap. That is a political decision. It didn't go down well apparently elsewhere. So we're using infrastructure or investment need rather than funding gap. So with that clarification, I see that Councillor Crosby's got a question.
Thank you. As along the same line, I get really nervous when I see forecasts like that, particularly when there's a sharp drop off from just about 32 to 34. I have seen numerous charts like that, particularly in our own LTPs, where you think you're falling into utopia around 2034. And the reality is that's because you don't know what you don't know. But I accept, you know, that's fallen out of a whole lot of documents. But I think we should have a big caution need on that particular graph. Because as we get into more work, that is going to change without doubt. And I could even go back to Network 96, which I keep bringing up, which sounds sad. But when you look at that and you overlay it with, and it's still relevant today, and you overlay it with multimodal transport, you know, I can see that line not dropping off in 2033, 34. And we just need to understand that, because if you're new into this, you can fall into a false sense of security. That's just the point I want to make.
Very wise point there, Councillor Crosby. Any more questions on this one? No? Okay, so there are two recommendations there to receive the report and agree that we monitor on a quarterly basis. Do I have a mover and a seconder, please? Deputy Mayor Scrimger, Councillor Scott. If there's no further debate, I'll put the motion. All those in favour, please say aye. Against? Carried. So that takes us to the end of the open session. So I think we'll move into confidential and then have our tea break. So can I have a mover and seconder to move into confidential? Mayor Drysdale, Deputy Mayor Scola, all in favour, please say aye. Against? Carried. Thank you very much. We'll come back in 10:05. Thank you.